Denselow. He's a writer on Middle East politics and security issues. Well, James, a lot of coverage on what's occurring in Libya at the moment, but of course we're hearing of unrest in Yemen, Bahrain and of course in Syria. And there, the government is promising reforms following a wave of deadly protests in the last week or so. What do you think is next for that country? Are we likely to see a civil war erupting there, or will we actually see the president's gesture of reforms appease the protesters?
Well, I think we're quite a long way away from civil war in Syria, yet what is happening there is quite unprecedented for a country that has enjoyed a snail pace of reform over the presidency of Bashar al-Assad since 2000. What he is supposedly willing to put on the table, as if his spokesman are to be believed, I mean, he hasn't really come out front and centre of this on these protests. He's been hiding behind his sort of ambassadors and his spokesman at the moment in Damascus, is that there is a possibility that the emergency law that has been in existence in the country since 1963, longer than the Assad dynasty itself, will be maybe reformed or perhaps got rid of. And of course, that has fundamental repercussions for the political economy of Syria. This could potentially mean political parties being able to be formed, the freedom of the media, a huge curtailment to the security laws that allow the police there to arrest people at will. And this could be a very different Syria to emerge from this, if he is to be believed. Because, of course, the contrary side of this argument is that the lesson learned from Mubarak and Ben Ali in Tunisia is that you have to try and stop the momentum of these protests if you are to survive them. And perhaps offering concessions to the silent majority in Syria who have not chosen which side to sort of put their stall on is a way by which he can kind of distill this whole conflict and therefore have time to consolidate his rule. So
if he isn't believed and we see the situation worsening, indeed we've seen the situation getting pretty bad with a severe crackdown on protesters with a number of deaths, could we see a foreign intervention there like we're seeing in Libya?
Well, I think it's bad to predict what's going to happen in the Middle East at the moment, but I would say that certainly from what we're hearing from Washington and from the Europeans, there is no appetite for expanding the current intervention that we're seeing in Libya. I think even in Libya, the Americans have been very quick to hand over to NATO and therefore sort of wash their hands of total responsibility for what will happen next there. Hillary Clinton was quoted as saying that she still believes that Bashar al-Assad is a reformer, someone who can potentially deliver a better Syria rather than heading down into civil war, which would have huge repercussions for the rest of the Middle East, bearing in mind Syria's geostrategic position. So I don't see any kind of appetite at present for Western intervention in Syria. That said, Syria has a legacy, mainly in the 80s, of heavy-handed clampdowns on its own sort of civil protests. And I think if we saw anything like what happened in, say, 1982 in Hama, the West would be forced to intervene simply because of the level of bloodshed. But I think, once again, we're a long way away from that right now.
You mentioned Syria's geostrategic position. Is it a more important country than the likes of Libya and neighbouring countries to the west?
Well, it's important in different ways, I think. I mean, certainly Libya has, say, more natural resources in terms of oil and is, of course, located right on the southern flank of some pretty powerful European states. Syria, on the other hand, is deeply intertwined in the Middle East peace process, relations with Israel. Of course, it has a long-standing and very complicated relationship with Lebanon, a country which still has yet to form a government following Syria's ally Hezbollah sort of bringing down the previous one, and of course has links with Iraq too. I'm interested in what I've heard from various commentators about the role the Saudis and the Jordanians have had in putting pressure on the Americans to sort of back off Syria. I mean, Syria usually is an easy punch bag for the American administration, who's always been quite happy to have a go at the state's actions and its lack of democracy and freedoms. But it is quite interesting to actually see the Americans almost defending Bashar al-Assad as a reformer today, I think, which is a reflection of how incredibly dynamic and fluid the situation is in the Middle East at present. And as I say, I think this is it's the biggest single challenge to Bashar's rule in 10 years, which is a huge event for Syria.
Can we just look at the implications beyond Syria, beyond Yemen, Bahrain, to Iran? Now, there has been speculation that there's a wider goal here, and that is to isolate Iran and force a regime change there. That, of course, coming from Western influences. Is that something you suspect?
Well, I think that's always been the intention of the West in terms of its policy towards Iran. It sees the Iranian regime as its sort of public enemy number one. And I think that, honestly, it would look to any means to do that. But often the fact is that Western support to opposition movements in these countries is actually far worse for those movements. It gives them, it takes away a huge amount of legitimacy from them because they're seen to be foreign-backed elements. What we've seen in Iran and certainly in Syria right now is a real domestic movement here that is not linked to the West's plans, policies or actions, but rather a domestic discontent with the way in which these regimes can actually run their state of affairs. Bearing in mind that Syria, it takes an actual state of emergency to get rid of a state of emergency, and that could only happen, I think, in a country which has real fundamental issues with how it governs its people.
James Denselow, writer on Middle East politics and security issues, thanks very much.